The throne of Mount Olympus is not held by divine right. It is held by force. We often picture the reign of Zeus as absolute and eternal. We imagine the Olympian god sitting comfortably above the clouds, completely untouched by the suffering and violence of the earth below. But the primary texts tell a very different story. The ancient world knew that the new regime of the cosmos was incredibly fragile because shortly after Zeus locked the Titans in the black pits of Tartarus, the earth itself decided it was time to tear Olympus down. Today, we are opening the ancient texts of Apollodorus, Pindar, and Ovid to examine the Gigantomachy. This is not a skirmish. This is a war of annihilation. We are going to look at the terrifying biological anomalies known as the Giants, the cosmic blackout orchestrated by the king of the gods, and the bloody, desperate realization that the immortal Olympians could not win this war alone. They needed a mortal executioner. To understand the Gigantomachy, we have to understand the sheer geological scale of the anger that caused it. The cosmos had just survived the Titanomachy, a 10-year war that shattered the world. Zeus had emerged victorious, and his first act as the undisputed sovereign was to banish the former rulers of the universe, the Titans, into Tartarus, a prison of absolute darkness located as far beneath the earth as the sky is above it. But Zeus made a critical miscalculation. He forgot who the mother of the Titans was: Gaia, the earth herself. Gaia was not just a passive landscape, she was a primordial, conscious entity, and she was furious. The Olympians had taken her children and buried them in the agonizing depths of her own subterranean bowels. Apollodorus tells us that Gaia's grief mutated into a terrifying, vengeful wrath. She sought out Tartarus, the primordial embodiment of the abyss, and mated with him. But the offspring of this union were not gods, and they were not men. They were the Gigantes, the giants. According to mythic tradition, the raw material for their creation had been festering in the earth for a long time. When the primordial sky father, Uranus, was castrated at the very dawn of time, his blood rained down upon the soil of Gaia. Now fueled by the earth's hatred for Zeus, that ancient, divine blood finally violently gestated. Ovid describes them bursting from the crust of the earth in the region of Phlegra, the burning lands. They were a nightmare of biological design. They were impossibly massive, their bodies a terrifying fusion of humanoid and reptilian anatomy. From the waist up, they were muscular, bearded warlords, with long, wild, unkempt hair that mirrored the untamed wilderness. But from the waist down, they did not have legs. Instead, their lower bodies were massive, writhing, scaled serpent tails. They did not just walk upon the earth, they were literally anchored to it, slithering and towering over the mountains, and they were born fully armed, carrying gleaming spears and holding a singular, programmed objective: the total extermination of the Olympian pantheon. The assault began immediately. The giants hurled entire flaming oak trees and massive jagged boulders into the sky, bombarding the crystal peaks of Olympus. The sky burned. The stars were obscured by the sheer volume of debris being launched from the earth. Zeus immediately rallied the Olympians for war, but a chilling revelation halted their counterattack. An oracle, a profound, inescapable cosmic truth, revealed the terms of this engagement. The Olympians, despite their absolute power, could not kill the giants. The divine hierarchy had a fatal glitch. The giants were born of earth and ancient blood. Against immortal weapons, they would only fall, heal, and rise again. The oracle declared that the giants could only be permanently destroyed if an immortal god and a mortal hero struck the killing blows together. But Gaia, the earth, knew of this prophecy too. To protect her serpentine children from this mortal loophole, she began to scour the deep forests and hidden valleys for a specific primordial herb, a magical, subterranean root that, if consumed by the giants, would render them entirely immune to the weapons of any mortal. If they found the herb, the war was over, the giants would become completely unkillable, and Olympus would fall. This is where Zeus demonstrates why he is the king of the gods. He does not rely solely on lightning. He relies on tactical, ruthless control of the environment. To stop Gaia from finding the herb, Zeus issued a terrifying decree. He commanded Helios, the god of the sun, to extinguish his chariot. He He commanded Selene, the moon, and Eos, the dawn, to halt their celestial movements. Zeus plunged the entire universe into absolute pitch-black darkness. Under the cover of this cosmic blackout, blind and groping in the dark, Gaia could not search the earth. Zeus moved through the shadows, located the magical herb himself, ripped it from the soil, and sequestered it away. The Earth's ultimate defense was neutralized. Now Zeus just needed his weapon. He needed a mortal. Zeus did not look for an army of men. He looked for a single, perfect instrument of violence. He sent Athena, the goddess of strategy, to summon his own mortal son, Heracles. But here the timeline shatters. If you are tracking the chronological history of the mythic world, a massive alarm should be ringing in your head right now. The Gigantomachy takes place at near the dawn of the Olympian era. Humanity barely exists, yet Heracles is a late-stage Mycenaean hero. He is generations removed from the dawn of man. He shouldn't be born for centuries. He shouldn't be here. To understand this, we must confront a fundamental, often frustrating reality about the ancient texts. Greek mythology is not a straight line. It is not a rigid, chronological spreadsheet. To force Greek myth into a single, flawless timeline is to completely misunderstand how the ancient world viewed these stories. Mythology is a layered tapestry driven by thematic and philosophical necessity, not linear dates. The ancient poets, like Pindar and Apollodorus, placed Heracles at the Gigantomachy because the meaning of the story demanded it. The cosmos required a mortal to save the immortal gods. Heracles, as the absolute pinnacle of human strength and the ultimate bridge between mortality and divinity, was the only logical candidate. The timeline bends to accommodate the myth. Time itself is warped so that the ultimate mortal weapon can stand upon the battlefield of the gods. Such is the myth's demand. Now back to the fray. Heracles arrives carrying a bow strung with the gut of a beast, and a quiver full of arrows dipped in the necrotic, highly lethal venom of the Hydra. With the mortal executioner standing beside the immortal gods, the cosmic equation was complete. The Olympians descended from the mountain. The Gigantomachy was not a single coordinated military engagement, it was a series of brutal, earth-shattering duels across the landscape. The first to fall was Alcyoneus, the greatest and most fearsome of the giants. Heracles, stepping to the front line, drew his bow and drove a poisoned arrow straight into the giant's massive chest. Alcyoneus crashed to the ground, but the moment his body touched the soil of Phlegra, the earth healed him. His eyes snapped open, the wound sealed, and he rose again. Stronger than before, Athena realized the mechanic of his immortality. Alcyoneus was invincible as long as he remained on the specific soil where he was born. "Drag him away," she commanded. Heracles abandoned his bow. He charged the towering monstrosity, grappling with the serpentine legs. Using his impossible mythic strength, Heracles physically lifted the writhing giant off the ground, carrying him across the borders of his homeland. The moment they crossed into foreign territory, the connection to the mother was severed. Heracles threw Alcyoneus to the dirt and executed him, fulfilling the prophecy. The battle escalated into absolute carnage. Porphyrion, a giant fueled by a dark, intoxicating madness, bypassed the front lines and charged directly at Hera, the queen of the gods. He sought to humiliate Zeus by violating his wife. As the giant lunged, ripping the divine robes from the goddess, Zeus reacted with immediate, uncompromising wrath. A massive, blinding bolt of lightning struck Porphyrion from the sky, shattering his concentration and scorching his flesh. As the giant reeled backward, Heracles stepped into his blind spot and drove an arrow through his skull. God and mortal acting in perfect lethal unison. Next came Eurytus. He was not met by a god of war, but by Dionysus, the god of wine and madness. Dionysus did not wield a blade, he fought with his thyrsus, a staff topped with a pine cone, historically wrapped in ivy and dripping with honey, but in the frenzy of the Gigantomachy, the thyrsus became a weapon of blunt force trauma, driving Eurytus to his knees before Heracles' arrow found its mark. The underworld joined the fray. Hecate, the goddess of magic and the dark crossroads, emerged from the shadows to face the giant Clichus. She did not use steel. She used the elements of her domain. She unleashed a torrent of hellfire from her blazing torches, immolating the giant alive, burning the serpentine scales from his body before Heracles delivered the final merciful strike. The landscape itself began to warp under the sheer destructive output of the gods. Hephaestus, the crippled god of the forge, abandoned his sanctuary. He faced the giant Mimas, not with martial arts, but with the brutal industrial power of the anvil. Hephaestus hurled massive, superheated projectiles of red-hot metal, slag straight from the core of the forge, burying Mimas beneath a mountain of molten iron. But it was Athena who unleashed the most terrifying display of martial dominance. She faced the giant Pallas. Athena did not just kill him, she utilized him. She struck Pallas down, and in a display of brutal pragmatism, she flayed the skin from his massive body while he was still writhing. She draped his impenetrable, monstrous hide over her own shoulders as armor, the aegis that would protect her for the rest of eternity. Immediately after, she turned her sights on the giant Enceladus. As the beast realized the battle was lost, he turned to flee across the earth. Athena did not chase him with a spear. She reached down, tore a massive landmass from the crust of the earth, and hurled it through the sky. The island crashed down upon Enceladus, burying him alive beneath billions of tons of rock. The ancient texts tell us that this landmass is the island of Sicily, and the volcanic eruptions of Mount Etna are simply the eternal, agonizing, fiery breaths of Enceladus, still trapped and struggling beneath the stone.
The final pursuit occurred on the seas. Poseidon, the Earthshaker, hunted the giant Polybutes as he slithered desperately through the churning waves. Polybutes reached the island of Cos, hoping to find refuge. Poseidon did not even bother to step ashore. With a single devastating strike of his trident, Poseidon broke off a massive chunk of the island itself. He hurled the broken landmass, creating the new island of Nissos, and dropped it directly on top of the giant, crushing his serpentine body under the depths of the ocean. To every single giant that fell, Heracles was there. He moved through the rubble, the fire, and the tidal waves, serving as the necessary prophesied executioner, delivering the final, fatal blow to every beast that the gods brought to their knees. When the dust finally settled, the burning lands of Phlegra were silent. The serpentine bodies of the giants lay broken, buried under islands, or burned to ash. Gaia's ultimate rebellion had failed. The Gigantomachy is not a story about the triumph of good over evil. In the ancient mythic mindset, it is a story about the terrifying, violent process required to establish order over chaos. The giants represented the raw, untamed, uncultivated power of the earth, a natural world that refused to be governed. The Olympians represented the new reality, civilization, hierarchy, and atmospheric dominance. Zeus had proven that his grip on the cosmos could not be broken by the old world. He had stopped the sun in the sky. He had utilized the mortal race he once despised as the ultimate biological weapon. The universe belonged to Olympus now, secured by lightning strategy and the blood-soaked arrows of a mortal king.